Welcome to this Wise Owl Excel VBA tutorial. In this part of our series on writing SQL for Excel files, we're going to cover conditional functions. We'll start with a quick look at the IF function and how to write logical tests to produce different answers based on whether a condition is true or false. We'll also look at how you can use IF to sort your queries in a different order. And we'll also look at how you can nest multiple IF functions to give yourself more logical tests in a single column. We'll look at how you can combine conditions using the and or logical operators, and also how you can include the in and between operators in your if functions. Towards the end of the video, we'll look at the switch function, which provides you with access to more logical tests in a simpler way. We'll look at how you can nest switch functions, and finally, how you can sort the results of a query using the switch function. So let's get started. If you've been following along with this series so far, you should be fairly familiar with the basic setup by now, so you may prefer just to skip to the next chapter of the video. If you haven't seen previous parts of the series, here's a quick look at how things work. We have a macro-enabled workbook which allows us to run a query by clicking this fairly obviously labelled button. And when we do that, it's going to extract some information from a separate Excel file called Movies, which contains a list of 1200 films with 14 columns of information. I'm going to keep the Movies workbook open, but you're welcome to close the file down. All of the code will still work, even if the Movies workbook is closed. I have both these files stored in the same folder, and I'll drop a link in the video description so that you can download these files yourself and follow along and write the code if you'd like to. The code in the Conditional Functions workbook relies heavily on Microsoft ActiveX data objects to establish the connection to the Movies file and then extract the data from it. The focus for this series is on the SQL query side of things, rather than the ActiveX data object side. Just in case you are interested in how the connections work, we have a separate playlist which covers that topic, and I'd recommend starting with this video, How Do I Get Data from a Closed Excel File Using VBA? Just to show you the very basic code that's triggered when we click the Run Query button, there's a simple subroutine called Create SQL Query, and really all this does is constructs a string which acts as our SQL query. I've written a sample one for us here that we're going to modify shortly. Then that string of text gets passed into a separate procedure called getQueryResults, and this is the one that deals with all the complicated stuff, such as establishing the connection to the Movies workbook. Opening up a record set, our query gets used at this point here to set the source for a record set. And then the remainder of the code deals with extracting that information and writing it out into a brand new worksheet. And there's some error handling code right down at the bottom of the subroutine as well. Just to show you the basics of how this works, if I head back to the Conditional Functions workbook on the menu sheet and hit that Run Query button, it will extract a selection of columns from the Movies workbook and create a nice, tidy, neat layout for those in a separate worksheet. For the first example, I'd like to add an extra column to our query output, which describes our films based on the value of the Oscar wins column. If the film doesn't have any Oscars, we'll describe it as a loser, otherwise we'll describe it as a winner. It's a fairly harsh system, but hey, that's life, I guess. To do this, we're going to use a technique that you may well already be familiar with. We're going to use an IF function. Now, there is one subtle difference in the IF function we're going to use here compared to the one you may be familiar with from Excel worksheet functions. The IF function we use here has an extra I in its name. Apart from that, the structure of the function is identical. We start with a logical test, which is a condition that must be either true or false. Then we provide the answer that we want to return if the logical test returns true, followed by the answer we want to return if the logical test returns false. So to do this, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we'll add a new column to our select list. First of all, apologies for anyone who's offended by the start of line comma style. I've mentioned this in previous videos. If you'd like to adjust the way I've written this query to put the commas at the end of the previous line, please do feel free. But I'm going to persist with my start of line comma style. It's the one I'm most comfortable with, so apologies if you're offended by that. I'm going to add a new line just after the end of the Oscar wins column, and then begin a new string by opening up some double quotes, followed by a comma, and then type in my if function, so IIf. I can then open up some round brackets, and then I need to check my first logical test. So I want to check if the value of Oscar wins equals 0. So rather than typing this all out again, I'm just going to copy and paste Oscar wins from the previous line. I'm using a table alias here, which isn't really necessary when my query only contains a single table in the first place. But again, later on in the series, when we start incorporating multiple tables in the same query, this will be a useful technique, so it's probably worthwhile getting used to earlier on. I'm then going to check if the result of the value of that column equals 0, followed by a comma. Then I want to provide the name of the description that I'd like to return if Oscar wins equals 0. So in some single quotes, I'm going to write the word loser, followed by another comma, and then in some more single quotes, the word winner. The extra spaces I've applied here just after the commas aren't necessary. That's just for readability purposes. I think I find it easier to read with an extra space after the comma, but that's very much optional. I can then close the round brackets at the end of the function, and then it would be sensible to provide a name for this new column we've just created. So I'm going to call this one as, and then I'm going to use the title awards. So the word awards I'm going to put into some square brackets to indicate that it's an identifier. I can then close my double quotes after a space, and then I want to concatenate that with a new line character, or a continuation character I should say, to join up the rest of the query. So having done all that, let's head back to the the menu sheet in the Conditional Functions workbook, run the query again, and this time we get a new column that describes the film as either a winner or a loser based on the simple condition we've set up. As well as comparing the value of a column against a constant value like the number 0, we can also compare one column against another column. So for the next example, let's compare the box office with the budget to see if our film made a profit or not. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then add a new line after our previous one, open some more double quotes, stick a comma in somewhere to make sure you separate this column from the previous one, and then we'll say if, open some round brackets. Again, rather than writing this out again from scratch, I'm going to copy and paste the columns that I've already written into my code, so I'll check if the box office is greater than the budget. Follow that with a comma, and if that condition returns true, let's say that the film should be described with profit. Then another comma, and in some other double quotes, I'll write the word loss. I appreciate that we haven't handled the situation where the box office might be equal to the budget, in which case we'd have a break-even situation, but I'm going to stick with just two simple possibilities at this point, profit or loss. I'll then close the round brackets and then provide a new name for this column. Let's call this one as finance or something like that. I then need to make sure that I've closed the double quotes and then concatenate that with a continuation character to join that to the remainder of our query. Having done that, let's head back to the menu sheet, run the query again, and we get another new column describing the film with profit or loss according to the comparison of box office to budget. We can also use date values in the logical tests of our if functions. For the next example, let's describe a film as old if its release date is before the 1st of January 2000, otherwise it will be described as modern, though it might be a bit of a stretch describing 21-year-old films as modern, but anyway, let's go for it. So back in the Visual Basic Editor, we can add another new column in the same way we've done before, so writing an if function, and this time we'll compare the value of the release date column. So I'm going to copy and paste that. I want to check if the release date is before or less than a certain date, and to write in explicit constant date values, you must wrap them up in some hash symbols or pound symbols when you're using the provider we're using to connect to an Excel worksheet. So inside there we can write our dates in a variety of formats. We've covered this in previous videos. I'm going to stick with the standard ISO 8601 style format, so that's year followed by a dash, followed by 2 digits for the month, followed by another dash and 2 digits for the day of the month. Close the hash symbols and then type in a comma, and if that condition is true I want to return the value old, otherwise I want to return the value modern. Then I can close the round brackets and provide another new alias or a new column name, and I'll call this one as age. I can then concatenate a continuation character to the end of that line, and then head back to the menu sheet, run the query again, and we get another new column based on the value of the release date column. So we've looked at comparing numbers and comparing dates. Let's have a quick look at comparing text. I'd like to create a column that provides my users with a recommendation as to whether a film is safe to watch or should be avoided. And the way I'm going to do that is by checking if the value of the genre column is equal to the word awful. Some of you who've been following previous parts of the series will know exactly which films are going to be avoided at this point, but for those of you who don't know, let's find out. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, we can add another new column to our select list in the same way we've done previously with an if function. And then I'm going to copy my f.genre and then check if it is equal to a particular string of text. Make sure you wrap your text in some single quotes, and it doesn't matter which case you write your text in. As we saw in previous videos on the where clause, string comparisons aren't case sensitive. We can type in a comma after that, and then in some single quotes, say the word avoid. Otherwise, I want to say that the film is safe, or maybe probably safe. We still might return films like Titanic, for example, which we probably still would want to avoid, but don't technically fall into the awful category. Anyway, I'm going to go with safe for this example, and we can build on this a bit later on. Let's add a column name or an alias. I'll say as recommendation, and then close the square brackets, close the double quotes, and concatenate a continuation character. Now if we head back to the menu sheet and we run this query, we'll find that we get to the new column, but it might be quite difficult to find all of the films to be avoided. It might be nice to sort this list by the recommendation we've made. Heading back to the Visual Basic Editor, it would be very nice to be able to say order by recommendation here, but as you may know if you've watched previous parts of the series, we can't simply refer to a column alias in the order by clause using this particular provider. It's a little bit annoying if you've worked in previous versions of or other versions of SQL like Transact SQL, where you can write column aliases in the order by clause. Anyway, at this point, the only option we would have here is to, or the simplest option I suppose we would have here, would be to copy and paste the if function that we've just written to generate that column of values. So I'm going to copy that, and in my order by clause I'm going to replace the part which orders by the film title in ascending order just by pasting in that entire if function. Having done that, let's head back to the menu sheet and run the query again, and we can finally find out which films we should definitely avoid watching, all those ones in the awful category. You can use if functions in the order by clause to produce a value which you can use to manipulate the sort order of your query results, without needing to display that value in your query output. So let's just modify our example a little bit. I'd like to be able to sort my films based on the value of the genre column, so sort alphabetically by genre, but I want to make sure that awful always falls to the bottom of the list. So normally the awful films would sit in between the animation and the comedy films alphabetically. I want to make sure that awful is always at the end of the list. So to make that work, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. I'm just going to modify the results returned by this order by clause. It's fairly pointless creating the full word avoid and the full word safe here. We're already producing and showing those values in the select list. In the order by clause, all we really need is to make sure that awful films have a higher value than non-awful films. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to change the word avoid to the number 1. So it has a bigger number than the safe films. So for the safe films, I'm going to put those as the number 0. So if I sort in ascending order of 0 and 1, then all the zeros will appear above all the ones. Just to demonstrate that, if I just run this query again, if I head back to the menu sheet and run that query, we'll find, although we can't see the number 1 and 0 in this table, that's not the important thing. If I head all the way down to the end of my list, I can see that all of the Twilight films are sitting now at the bottom. Now I can sort by a second category, so I could sort alphabetically by genre in the same order by clause. If I head back to my Visual Basic Editor, and at the end of the first column in my order by clause, I'll just write all of this onto a single line, but I need to separate the columns in my order by clause with commas. And I'm going to say f.genre. Again, I could have copied and pasted that. And then say ASC. So having done that, if I head back to the menu sheet and I run that query again, we can see that I get my films sorted alphabetically by genre. So I get all the action films, all the adventure films after that, and then all the animation films. But where the awful films would normally sit, they're no longer there. They're all the way down at the bottom of the list, which is where they should be. So far, the results of our if functions have been very simple values like strings of text or a simple number as in the previous example. But you can also use if functions to perform different calculations based on the result of a condition. To demonstrate this, I'm just going to tidy things up a little bit. I'm going to head back to my menu sheet and click the Delete All But menu sheet button. And then I'm going to go back to the Visual Basic Editor and I'm going to change my order by clause so that it goes back to sorting by the film title. So order by f.title in ascending order, and I'll get the square brackets in the correct place there as well. There we go. What I'd then like to do is write a calculation which divides the Oscar wins by the Oscar nominations in order to work out the win ratio. So to do that, let's add a new column to our select list. And this won't involve the if function just yet. I'm just going to take the f.oscarwins value and then divide that by the f.nominations. I'll give this an alias. I'll call it win ratio. And then concatenate to the end of that a continuation character. Head back to the menu sheet and then run that query again. So you can hopefully see here that our formula hasn't returned a result for every single row. We've got lots of blanks or nulls in this column. And the nulls appear whenever we've tried to divide the Oscar wins by a 0 for the Oscar nominations. Had you done this in Excel, you'd receive a divide by 0 error. But with ADODB and the provider we use to connect to an Excel workbook, the error is converted into a null, so we receive an empty cell. I think that looks a little messy. I'd prefer to see a 0 in place of the empty cell. We could achieve that in a couple of different ways. We could check if the nominations equals 0, then display a 0 in the cell, otherwise perform the calculation of wins divided by nominations. But then we might be able to save ourselves a bit more time as well. If the Oscar wins is 0, it's pointless dividing 0 by a value of nominations because the result would be 0 anyway. So let's check if the Oscar wins equals 0, then produce 0, otherwise perform the division that we've tried to perform. Heading back to the Visual Basic Editor, we can simply add an if function to the beginning of this current expression. So let's say if, and then open some round brackets, and then check if the value of the Oscar wins column equals 0. So I'm just going to copy that column name as I've already written it there, and then check if it's equal to 0, followed by a comma. If that's true, produce a 0. Otherwise, produce the result of that calculation, Oscar wins divided by nominations. I'll then just need to close the round brackets at the end of that expression, and then if I head back to my menu sheet and run that query again, I've got a slightly neater column now with a value in every single row. Next, I'd like to improve on the first column we created, which described our films as winners or losers. Is it really fair to describe a film as a loser if it never had a chance of winning anything in the first place? I think not. I'd like to create a third category, so we're going to check if the Oscar nominations is 0, then we'll describe the film as not nominated, otherwise it's a winner or a loser according to the same condition we've already created. The problem at the moment, of course, is that the if function as we've used it so far only provides an option for one answer if the condition is true and a different answer if the condition is false. But we have just seen in the previous example that we can make the answer if true or the answer if false another calculation. So what if we replace the answer if false with another if function to create a nested if function? So we could ask our first logical test and provide an answer if that logical test returns true. If the first logical test returns false, we could check another condition by nesting another if function inside. So let's have a quick go at doing that. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to just modify the existing column that we've created. So rather than rewriting this one from scratch, this will become the false part of our of our new if function. So I'm going to begin a new if function at the beginning of this line, if I can click in the right place eventually, there we go. And we're going to say if, open some round brackets, I'm going to capture or copy and paste the f.nominations and check if that is equal to 0, followed by a comma. And if that condition is true, I want to return the phrase not nominated, followed by another comma. And then everything which follows forms the false part of the first if statement or if function. The conditions tested in here is the same as earlier, so if the Oscar wins is 0, but this is automatically implying now that the film must have been nominated for at least one Oscar, but its Oscar wins is 0, then it can be legitimately described as a loser, otherwise it must be a winner. Don't forget to close as many sets of round brackets as you have opened. So in this case, because we have two if functions in the same expression, we need to make sure we close two sets of round brackets at the end. So having done all that, if I head back to my menu sheet again and I run my query, we should now find that we get not just winner and loser, but we also get not nominated as well. So we've just seen that you can use a nested if function to increase the number of logical tests you can make in the same column, and you can carry on nesting if functions to increase the number of logical tests you can use. You can also ask multiple conditions in the same logical test of a single if function by combining your logical tests using the and or logical operators. Just to demonstrate briefly how that works, I want to expand on our recommendation column. I want to tell users to avoid watching a film if the genre is either awful or romance. So to make that work, I can head back to the Visual Basic Editor and I can find my recommendation column, and I've already got the expression or the logical test which checks if the genre equals awful. I'm just going to copy that, and then immediately afterwards I'm going to type in a space followed by the word or, and then paste in that same logical test. Of course, the next one I want to check isn't the awful genre again. I want to change that to say romance. So with the or operator, as we covered in the video on adding the where clause and writing conditions to filter out your results, if either of these two logical tests returns true, then the result of the entire combination of logical tests is true. So if we now head back to the menu sheet and we run that query again, we'll find that if the film is a romance or it's a awful film, it will be told, or we will be told, to avoid that film. Now, as we saw in the video on adding criteria to queries, there are often shortcuts you can take when you want to combine multiple logical tests. For this example, rather than using two conditions separated with the or keyword, we could use an in operator instead. So let's change the condition to say if f.genre, and then change the equals operator to the word in, and open up some round brackets before the word awful. Then we can take away the or f.genre equals, and separate awful from romance with a comma, and then close the extra set of round brackets after the word romance, and of course we could carry on writing another comma separated list if there were any other films or genres we wanted to avoid. But with those two done, if I head back to the menu sheet and run that query again, we'll see the same list of results with the films that we want to avoid, with all of the romance and all of the awful films included in that list. We can also combine multiple logical tests using the AND operator. Let's create a new column to describe a film as a blockbuster if it took at least $1 billion at the box office and it was nominated for at least 10 Oscars. So to make that work, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor and we can add another new column to the end of our select list by opening some more double quotes, followed by a comma, and then the if function. So I'm going to start by checking if the box office was greater than or equal to 1 billion. So I'm going to copy and paste box office greater than or equal to 1 followed by 9 zeros. After that, I'm going to type in the word and then check if the Oscar nominations field contains a value of at least 10. So f.nominations greater than or equal to 10. So only if both conditions are met will a film receive the description we'll type in after this comma. I'm going to call this a blockbuster. Otherwise, the film will just be described as standard, normal, basic. I don't know. I'll put in the word normal in some single quotes, close some round brackets, and then I'm going to give this column an alias. I'll call it status, if I can spell that correctly. Then I need to close the double quotes and concatenate this with another continuation character, and then that's the entire query done. I'd also like to modify the sort order so that we can see the blockbusters more clearly at the top of our list. So rather than sorting by film title, I'm going to change that to sort by box office, and I'm going to go in descending order rather than ascending. Okay, so having done that, we can head back to our menu sheet and run the query again, and we'll find the blockbuster films if we have enough space to see them all. There we go, so a couple of blockbuster films sitting near the top of the list. You can sometimes write multiple AND conditions using a shorthand version in a similar way to the technique we used to combine our OR conditions using the IN operator. For the next example, I'd like to pick out films based on a preferred range of runtimes. I think maybe say 120 to 130 minutes is an optimal time for a film to last. So I want to describe films as optimal if they have a runtime between 120 and 130 minutes. Now we can write this out the longhand way first. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to create a new column. It's like running out of space here on the end of my screen, but there we go. So I'll add a new column starting with a basic if function that's going to check if f.runtime, and again I could have copied and pasted that and perhaps should have done based on the mess I've made of typing this, f.runtime greater than or equal to 120. And I'll just copy and paste this one. f.runtime is less than or equal to 130. Now that's not a particularly long pair of conditions to write, but it still means that I've got to reference the runtime field a couple of times. Just to demonstrate that it does work, let's provide a description for that. I'm going to call that one optimal, and then the false part will say something like, let's say suboptimal. Close the round brackets and then provide an alias as preferred range or something along those lines. And then concatenate that with a continuation character at the end. So having done that, let's head back to the menu sheet and run that query, and we'll find a range of optimal and suboptimal films based on the runtime range. If we wanted to shorten that, if we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, we can say rather than greater than or equal to, we could replace that with the between operator. And then we can take away the f.runtime less than or equal to 130. So the condition becomes much shorter, runtime between 120 and 130. The end results are the same. If we head back to the menu sheet, we can run that query again, and we'll see the exact same list of optimal and suboptimal, just with a slightly shorter way of writing that set of conditions. So we've done a lot of examples using the if function. Let's move on and look at the switch function for the next section of the video. Just before I do that, I'm going to tidy things up a little bit. I'm going to head back to the menu sheet first and delete everything but the menu sheet by clicking the handy button there. And I'll also want to tidy up some things in the Visual Basic Editor as well. Switch functions can become quite long. We can write multiple logical tests in the same switch function, and I'm going to be writing these out onto separate lines in the same expression or in the same statement in VBA. Now there is a limit to the number of continuation characters you can have in one single string, and the limit is 25 of these. So just to avoid running into the problem of the limit of continuation characters, which would mean we then have to write several separate statements or several separate strings and concatenate them all together at the end, I'm just going to take a bunch of stuff away from this particular query. So I'm going to get back to I'll get rid of the release date column first of all. So let's remove that line entirely. We shan't need that. And I don't think we'll need the genre or the budget or the box office, but I'll keep the runtime, the nominations and the Oscar wins. I'm also going to get rid of a bunch of the extra calculated columns we created and go back to just the awards column, the very first one that we created and then subsequently modified. So let's get rid of all of those additional lines there. So all we have is title, runtime, nominations, Oscar wins, and our basic if function. For our first example of a switch function, I'd like to replicate what we've done here with our nested if function. So we'll calculate the exact same categories not nominated, loser and winner. To get started, the basic switch function is like a simplified if function. You have a logical test and you have an answer if true. And that's the maximum you actually have to do for a switch function. So let's get started with that basic version first of all. I'm just going to copy and paste some things from my previous line. So I'm going to copy the if function, the first condition, and the value if true, or the answer if true. I can then place that on the next line. And then I can close the round brackets for the function. I'll give it an alias as awards2. And then I can concatenate that with a continuation character to the next line. All I need to do now is change the if function to the switch function instead. And having done that, let's head back to the menu sheet, run that query, and we'll return, for those films that have 0 Oscar nominations, the correct description of not nominated. But you can see that it's produced a blank or a null for every film which does not have a 0 in the Oscar nominations. Now we need to deal with the other two possibilities. The film is either a winner or a loser. And to do that, we need to increase the number of logical tests in the switch function. But this is a little easier to do than it was with nested if functions earlier on. The beauty of a switch function is it's really just a sequence of logical tests and the answer to return if that logical test is true. So you don't need to worry about nesting switch functions or how many round brackets you have opened or closed. You just write the sequence of logical tests followed by the answers you want to receive. So to expand on our example, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And I think it probably makes sense to lay out our query a bit more neatly at this point. So just after I've opened up the round brackets after the switch function, I'm going to type in a set of closed double quotes and then concatenate that with a continuation character and take the condition and the answer down to the next line. I'm then going to indent that line and open up some more double quotes there. And I'm going to place the logical test and the answer if true on the same line. And then I'm going to close some double quotes there and concatenate this with another continuation character and take the end of that statement down to the next line and then open up some more double quotes. Now, just to make sure that I get everything lined up as neatly as I like them, I'm going to add a space just before the first logical test there. So f.nominations has a space. Purely for readability purposes, I just want to make sure that all of my table aliases and column names line up. You don't need that extra space there. On the next line then, I'm going to begin with a comma to keep with my start of line comma style. And then I want to check my next condition, which is f.OscarWins equals 0, then produce the word loser. So I'm just going to copy and paste that from my previous example rather than write the whole thing out again from scratch. So at that point, if I head back to the menu sheet and then I run that query again, I'll find that I get both not nominated and losers. Finally, I want to produce the word winner for any remaining values, so anything that does not have 0 in the Oscar nominations and does not have 0 in the Oscar wins must be a winner. Now to do that, I could write a logical test which explicitly checks if the Oscar wins value is greater than 0. But that has to be the case anyway, based on our data and the conditions we've written so far. So rather than adding another explicit logical test for the last line, what we're going to do instead is, first of all, break this into another line. So I'm going to close the double quotes after the word loser, and then concatenate that with a continuation character. And at the beginning of the next line, open some more double quotes, followed by a comma. Now the result of a logical test can either be true or false. And at this point, any logical test I perform on Oscar wins, if I checked Oscar wins is greater than 0, that would automatically return true. It has to, because I've already eliminated the films that have a 0 in the Oscar wins column. So all I'm going to do is shortcut this by writing the value true, followed by a comma, and then the answer I want to return, which is the word winner. If it makes you feel better, you can of course write the explicit test. We could write f.oscarwins greater than 0 in place of the word true, but as the result of that expression would be true anyway, this is a shorter, neater way to do things. So having done that, let's head back to the menu sheet and run that query again, and we'll see we now get the exact same set of end results using a switch function instead of add set of nested ifs. Now with the example we've just used here, there isn't a huge amount of time saved by using a switch function instead of some nested ifs. But the more conditions you want to test in your switch function, the more useful they become and the shorter your code will eventually be. So for the next example, let's say we wanted to categorize our films based on the runtime. So let's say if it's less than 100 minutes, it's a short film, between 100 and 150 it's medium, and so on for several different categories. To do that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And this is definitely something that's much easier to do with a switch function rather than multiple nested ifs. So let's add a new column, starting with a comma and the switch function. Open up some round brackets and close the double quotes, and then concatenate that with a continuation character before heading down to the next line, opening some more double quotes and typing in a space. So I'm just going to copy and paste my f.runtime field, and then check if that is less than 100, followed by a comma, and if that's true, I'd like to produce the word short. I can then close the double quotes and then concatenate a continuation character, and then rather than writing the next condition out again from scratch, I'm actually going to copy and paste that line. The pattern of the conditions you write is always the same, basically, for something like this at least it is. So I'm going to replace that space there with a comma, and then I'm going to check if the runtime is less than 150, then the film is medium. I don't need to explicitly test if the runtime is greater than or equal to 100 and less than 150, or I could write it as runtime between 100 and 149, that would also work. The reason I don't need to do that is because I've already eliminated the films with a runtime of less than 100 on this line. They will automatically be described as short, so they don't meet this second condition. They can't possibly belong to the medium category. Having done that, let's continue. I'm going to paste in the condition again, or the copied line again, type in a comma instead of a space, and then change the number I'm testing for to the number 200, change the word short to the word long, and we could continue in this vein for as many different conditions as we like, just with one single switch function rather than the many nested ifs we would require. I think that's enough conditions to test for in this example, so I'm going to paste in my conditions one last time, and then I'm going to replace the space with a comma, and then I'm going to change my condition to the word true. Replace the description with the word epic, or really long, or too long, or whatever else you like. And then I'm going to close the round brackets after the word epic and say as film length. So there we go, there's our final switch function written. I'm just going to tidy up a little bit more again and take away the extra set of nested ifs that calculates the awards column. I'm just going to change the column name, the alias for the switch function, to just awards rather than awards 2. And having done that, let's head back to the to the menu sheet, run our query again, and we get a nice long list of films described as either short, medium, long, or epic, depending on their runtime. Earlier we saw that we can nest if functions to increase the number of logical tests we can make in the same column. Now you don't tend to need to do that with switch functions quite so much, because you can simply list as many conditions as you like within the same switch function. And you can use combinations of and or operators to make those conditions as complicated as you like as well. Just out of interest though, it is possible to nest switch functions within each other, or nest a switch function inside an if, or an if function inside a switch. So just to demonstrate that it's possible, just in case you find a need for it, let's create a single switch function that's going to produce a description such as long winner, medium loser, etc. So it'll combine the two categories we've created so far into a single column. I'm going to head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to start by copying and pasting this entire query. I'm going to make quite a lot of changes to this, and then I want to be able to go back quickly to the other version. So I'm going to paste that in a little further down my query, and then I want to comment out one of those two statements. So you don't need to comment out every single line, because every line is joined together with a continuation character. You can just go to the very beginning of the first line, type in a single quote or an apostrophe, and that will comment out the entire block of code. So with this second version, what I'd like to do is, first of all, get rid of the words not nominated, and get rid of the word loser, and get rid of the word winner. Because what we're going to do is replace each of those individual words with a complete nested switch function. I'm never quite sure of the best layout for this, so I'm just going to copy and paste basically, and almost hope for the best with this. So I'm going to copy my second switch function from the word switch, without the preceding a comma, all the way down to the closed round brackets at the end of that function. I will have some modifications I'll need to make here, but I'm just going to paste that in after the comma of f.nomination. So if I paste that in, I'm then going to highlight all the lines of code below the initial switch function and indent those one space to make things a little easier to read. Okay. So my first switch function checks is the nominations equal to 0, and if that's true, it's then going to check whether the runtime is less than 100, etc, etc. And what I'd like to do then is place the words not nominated. I should perhaps not have deleted those words earlier on. So short not nominated. And I want to paste that same descriptor to the end of each of the other film lengths. So there we go. Next, let's take the next switch function. So let's see, we've got the Oscar wins equals 0. If that condition is true, I basically want to paste in the exact same switch function. So I'm going to click just after the comma there, where f.Oscar wins equals 0, and paste in, sorry, beg pardon, I should have copied it first, of course. Let's try that again. So I'll take the entire switch function from the word switch down to the end of the closed round brackets, and then paste that in just below. So this time it's going to be short loser. That wasn't meant to be an insult, but I appreciate it sounded like one. Medium loser, long loser, and then epic loser. That definitely sounds like an insult. So there we go. Okay, finally, the same basic thing again. I'm going to copy my switch function and the all the way down to the closed round bracket of that switch function, and paste it in at the end of the true part of the initial switch function. There we go, I've hit my limit of too many line continuations, so I've exceeded 25. I should be able to resolve that by getting rid of a good section of this. In fact, I can remove that entire separate column there. So the switch function that I copied to generate the film length can be removed entirely from the query at that point, and that should give me just enough to concatenate everything in one single gigantic switch and nested switch function. So finally, changing the word loser to the word winner, and then replacing the word loser in all of the other places. Let's call this length awards, perhaps. And then we can give the entire thing a quick test. Hopefully you won't find yourself doing this very often in the real world, but just to demonstrate that it is possible and that it does work, if we head back to the menu sheet and run that query, we get all of these values combined based on the runtime and the Oscar wins and nominations all in one single column. So while it's possible to nest switch functions, as I said earlier, you don't tend to find that you need to do that very often. In this particular example, there's a much better solution to nesting those switch functions. I'm just going to head back and delete the entire example that we just created. Sorry for all that hard work that's just then deleted. And then if we uncomment the original query just by taking away the apostrophe at the very beginning there, I just want to rearrange the order of my two switch functions. So I'm going to take the not nominated loser and winner switch function, the awards switch function, cut that, and then paste it in on the next line. So let's just place that in there, get rid of the extra blank line that's been created. And then, rather than having these generated as two separate columns, I'm going to take away the alias from the first column. So that generates the words short, medium, long, and epic. And then rather than concatenating these together with a comma to separate the column definitions, I'm going to replace that with a ampersand and a single space character contained within some single quotes, and then another ampersand to concatenate the result of the second switch function to the result of the first. So all of this is one single column's definition at this point. It's just concatenating the result of the first switch function with a space and then the result of the second switch function. So having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet and we can run that query again, and we get the same end result a little bit more efficiently and with a lot less code to write and maintain. For the final example, I'd like to include an extra column in my select list without calculating a new value. So at the end of the select list, before the from clause, I'm going to bring in the f.certificate column and then concatenate that with a continuation character, and then just head back to my menu sheet and run that query to see the results. So we have a range of different film certificates. I'd like to be able to sort my films based on the certificate that was awarded to them, but I'd like to see them sorted in essentially age order. So I want to see the U certificated films appearing at the top, followed by PG and then 12A and 12 and 15 and so on. Now that doesn't work at the moment. If I try to sort based on the result of the certificate column, if I change my sort order to f.certificate and I'll go in ascending order, then of course this is going to sort alphabetically if I head back to the menu sheet and run the query, so 12 films appear first. I want to change that and I'm going to use a switch function to do it. I'm going to assign a sort order number to each certificate in the certificate column using the switch function. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and in the order by clause, I'm not going to sort by certificate, I'm going to order by switch, and then open some round brackets, close a set of double quotes there, and then concatenate that with a continuation character and begin on the next line with f.certificate equals, and then look for the letter U. Now it isn't case sensitive again, I've just happened to have written the letter U in uppercase this time. And if the certificate has the value U in it, I want to assign the number 1 to that. Okay, so I can then close the double quotes and then concatenate this with another continuation character. And then at the beginning of the next line, open up some more double quotes, type in a comma, and then I'm just going to copy and paste everything to the end of the previous line and check if the certificate equals PG, then assign the number 2. And then I want to make sure that I take this ascending down to the next line, and then I'm just going to copy and paste from this point onwards, I think. So f.certificate equals 12A, then it should have the number 3. Take ascending down to the next line, and then 12, and you probably get the idea at this point. You may just want to speed through the rest of this little section. So we have a few more to do. 15, which will be number 5, and then finally 18, which will be number 6. And there may be some certificates that I haven't provided an explicit value for. So on the next line, what I'm going to do is say true, and then for anything which remains, just assign a value of 7, and then close the round brackets and sort that in ascending order. Okay, so having done all that, of course, this column of numbers won't appear in our query output, but it will be used to sort the results of our queries so that when we head back to the menu sheet and run the query again, we see all the U certificated films first, followed by the PG and 12A and 12 and so on to the end of the list. So there we go, there's a few examples of using if and switch functions to generate conditional values in your query results. In the next video, we're going to be using some of the techniques we've seen here to check for nulls in your queries and do different things according to whether a null has been found or not. So hope you're looking forward to that one. Thanks very much for watching as always. See you next time.